Vietnam, at war for 20 years. Beneath the familiar images of battles and horror, a people struggle on with the day-to-day tasks that don't sell newspapers, the wearying business of simple survival. 3 journalists assigned to cover the war talk about this other Vietnam, the Vietnam that doesn't make the headlines. Mark Frankland in Saigon, Dick West in the Mekong Delta, and with the American forces, Peter Arnett.
I think this means the war's going to be over. When the United States gets out of here, which it may start doing soon, the war's not going to be over. The Vietnamese are going to continue to fight it between themselves, but it'll be a battle between the Vietnamese. That's probably how it should have been in the first place.
Arnett, a New Zealander, works for Associated Press. He came to Vietnam 6 years ago and has won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting of the war.
The new journalists covering this new kind of war are different to the old timers. We're more realistic than patriotic. It seems to me that the older journalists don't seem to understand that this war is different. Just look down there. There's no front lines. You see islands of security in a communist sea. Those base camps could be wagon trains drawn up in circles to fight off the Indians. But this isn't the Wild West, and there's no World War II or Korea. This is a David and Goliath struggle, and the innocent civilians, they're caught in the middle. Reporters have been more aware of their suffering probably than in any previous war. And not only because they're hurting badly. It's because this is basically a political war, and you can't win that only with guns.
Right now, but since you guys have the fuel, I'm going to work a little bit longer and see if I can pick something better.
How could anybody live through that?
Yeah.
You know, you got so much firepower and all of the jets and the armed helicopters and the artillery and everything else we could throw at them. You know, and you get the feeling, well, golly, you know, as a newcomer, I sit here and I see all this stuff going on 500 meters in front of me. How could anybody live through that?
Arnett likes to see and question for himself. He reckons to spend a fortnight each month in the field.
We don't go around just popping villages. What I mean by this, just find a village and then arbitrarily take it under fire and burn it to the ground. In fact, it's quite rare that this ever happens.
When you get up there, how do you tell who's friendly and who's the enemy on the ground? How do you know you're not killing innocent people?
Well, simply by the uniform and by the weapon that he carries, mainly. And by the fact that he usually shoots at you real fast. That usually takes care of the whole problem.
You've been at Vietnam 2 years now. What do you feel about the American objectives here?
We have this great number of American soldiers in Vietnam, and we've lost so many people that that's such a commitment to us, to me personally. If we was to leave Vietnam tomorrow, I'd think that my 21 months in country were a complete loss, just a complete waste.
What he's asking for is a continuation of the interminable, non-productive, open-ended American commitment in Vietnam.
An infantry patrol waits for the helicopters. The company commander is Captain Haramoto from Hawaii.
It is said that this is the first war in which the infantry supports the air and artillery, and not the other way around as in previous wars.
Roger, as soon as you have all troops clear around to the ground, give me enough to look. And they can come back in on that then. Okay. Okay, I need to clear around the ground, so, yeah.
all the movement is first.
North route.
How about that shit?
The war now is bogged down in stalemate. It means days of endlessly patrolling deep jungles, across hot paddy fields. And the American soldiers out there, they hardly ever see the people who are shooting at them. America has enough troops in Vietnam to prevent the other side winning. But unfortunately, it hasn't got enough to beat them, and that's where the stalemate lies. The ordinary GI doesn't know much about Vietnam, and it's not his fault. Usually the only Vietnamese he sees are the ones he's killed. He's sent here as a soldier, he's sent here to do a job, that's to kill the other side or to kill Charlie, and that's about it. Even when he does get out, when, say, he gets to Saigon for a little fun, for some human companionship, he sees the worst side of the country, and he'll get fleeced in the first few hours. The bar girls of Saigon are tough. They're the toughest in Asia.
Where'd you get that cigar?
I just have one.
Have you had any major contacts recently?
Yes, we're working on a similar operation to this one. Just a normal eagle flight, working into the jungle area. As we got into the area for about a distance of 300 to 400 meters, we ran into what I consider to have been an enemy ambush. In other words, they were waiting there, waiting for us to come on in. As soon as we got in close enough to them, they sprung their ambush.
About how close was that?
It was about 20 meters.
20 meters.
I don't care to go through another experience like that.
This is a seductive war for reporters. I must admit that. There is danger out there, but it's tempting. You can spend the morning in a helicopter watching the battle unfold below you. You can walk with the troops. And yet in the afternoon, you can return to Saigon and write your story and dine at a fine restaurant. I can always leave a battle and return to Saigon, but those guys, they have to stay out there.
Unlike most journalists in Saigon, Arnett has his wife and family with him.
Come on. We're still going to teach him to swim, I tell you.
You come here, mommy. No, come here.
Slugging around the field. A lot of GIs have said to me, "You've been here 6 years. How can you stand it?" But let's face it, I can hitch a ride in a helicopter, and in a couple of hours I can be in a very different Vietnam.
Of the United States 7th Regiment, 1st Marine Division. During the operation, 53 enemy were killed. 856 suspects were detained. U.S. casualties were 9 killed, 46 wounded, of whom 32 were evacuated.
This is the daily Saigon briefing. We call it the 5 o'clock follies, which gives a good idea of what most of us feel about it. We get a very different view of the war in the field than is told here. This is one of the reasons why there's been such a rift between the military authorities and the press. This opposing view of what is happening became so bad over the years that I often wondered which side we were on. Most professional soldiers here are hawks. They want to fight the war to victory. But 90% of the guys are draftees. They don't want to be here.
I really don't know what we're fighting for. I mean, nobody knows that. And it's a different kind of feeling. Like when you're back in the States, they make it sound different, you know.
How do they make it sound like that?
Well, they make it sound like it's really that terrible. I mean, it is bad, you know. They make it sound like the minute you get off the airplane, you're gonna step in the mine and there you go, you know. And that's not true. You know?
Have you had any friends killed over here?
Oh yes, I had a couple of friends killed. The 9th this month, I was lucky not to be in that fight, but it was really terrible.
What do you see of the Vietnamese people? Do you ever meet any?
Oh yes, I have quite a few friends out there in the road. We're not allowed to buy cokes from them, you know, stuff like that. They sell it to us, and we don't really mind buying from them. Like they tell us the cokes, they put acid in them, they try to kill you.
Yeah.
These people don't try to do anything because they make a living.
Do the guys ever talk about the news about the possibility of a withdrawal, about Americans getting out?
Well, you see, over here we don't, I mean, we listen, you know, to the radio and listen to them tell us that they're going to pull us out, but there don't seem to be any action. Like, when we see the airplanes loading, then we'll say we're going back. Meanwhile, all we think about is the time. Let time go by.
The Americans want out of Vietnam. The war is costing too much blood, too much money. And a lot of money is spent needlessly. One division base camp has 6 swimming pools, 2 massage parlors, and 2 steam baths. This is something that soldiers in other wars didn't have, and many critics believe that the soldier today doesn't need this sort of thing, that he's got too many comforts. And the worst aspect of it is that it's not the man who's doing the fighting that's benefiting from all this.
Well, what we're trying to do with the Holiday Inn is give the men something they can identify with the stateside. In that snack bar, you could buy anything that you could buy back in the United States in a drive-in type restaurant. Hamburgers, hot dogs, soda pop, milkshakes, French fried potatoes.
Can you get kippers for breakfast?
Negative to that.
I've noticed in some other base areas a popular facility is a steam bath and massage parlor. But
well, right now we're still under construction, but we are going to put our steam bath and massage right back behind the snack bar. You've got to realize we are out in a forward zone. We are one of the most westernmost outposts in this war. We're only, 13 kilometers from the Cambodian border. Next to that, we have going up our tailor shop. Merchants from Hong Kong come in. They'll measure you up for a suit. I think usually it takes about 5 fittings to get the suit exactly right. We also have a swimming pool. We filter that water every day. It's clean. In addition to that, if the man requests anything in particular, he wants ice cream, we get him ice cream. If he wants to take a swim in the pool with a female, we have nurses over here that generally are more than obliging. We have the Red Cross donut dollies who will come by and they'll take a dip in the pool with the guys too. They have a real good time, get away from the war for a while, and just plain relax, which is what they need most.
Yeah, I bet they enjoy it.
Liền giờ phút này đến văn phòng ấp để đến tại văn phòng ấp.
Only now do the Americans realize that the problem of Vietnam is the problem of the people. The other war. If any good's going to come out of this war, it'll be in this area, what is euphemistically called pacification.
Ask her if does his nose bleed just at night?
Này máu cam thường nó bị chảy máu cam hồi vào lúc nào buổi tối hả?
Tối hay không?
Okay, can we have some APCs for all, please? All right, tell her to give the baby one of these every 6 hours. Cut his hair shorter and wash it good with that soap twice a day.
Tối này bà cho ngày 2 lần sáng viên, chịu viên, còn cái này về cắt tóc cho nó cục cho sạch sẽ thì nó hết chứ gì.
Ask him if I saw him last time about the same thing.
Có lần trước nó có tới đây nó phát thuốc, ông có gặp nó chưa?
Hôm có phát trên này đây là cho tôi uống hết rồi nay.
Nhưng mà ông có gặp nó không?
Không, tôi gặp bác sĩ này chưa?
Chưa.
He said last time, you know, they have a man came up right down here, but this time, you know, he don't know.
Okay, all right.
He don't know. He might forget.
Ask him if he's how old he is.
Ông được mấy tuổi rồi ông?
73.
73 years.
I think I saw him last time.
Đó, cơ xương cứng lắm mà.
Tức là ngài cấp cho nó uống từ từ. Đó nè.
Dimetap and some APCs. Okay, Papa Son. Strong as an ox. Tell him to take a teaspoonful of that every 6 hours.
It is my personal belief that the Americans underestimated those they were fighting and misjudged the effectiveness of the other side's political propaganda. There's been many pacification programs in Vietnam, and yet looking in retrospect, they just don't seem to have made it. Do you have any new ideas or new angles to use?
I don't think there are really new ideas, but I think we've learned from some of the mistakes we've made in the past. Sometimes we've tried to do too much. Now we're not trying to do things so much for the Vietnamese as to help them do things for themselves. It's a two-pronged approach. While the fighting is going on around us, regular forces are attempting to keep out the main forces of the enemy. Vietnamese forces, civic action teams like mine, attempt to build while the fighting is going on elsewhere.
But do you think that that American military people coming out here in jeeps can do this? Can they make the approach to the population through the language barrier and the cultural barrier?
I think so, because we attempt to stay out as much as we can out of the cultural area. Certainly, I'm an American. I'm not a Vietnamese. I'm not inside a Vietnamese's skin. I don't think or feel the way he does. So when I attempt to deal with these people, I don't attempt to do it from my standpoint. I try as much as possible to see it from theirs.
You give these people things, little gifts of cash and little presents. Isn't there a danger of creating a beggar mentality amongst the Vietnamese?
I don't really think so. It depends very much on what you give them. We use small gifts sort of as a means of getting our foot in the door. In fact, when we finish our meal today, I'll leave for the lady who owns this restaurant something like this. It contains Vietnamese soap, tobacco, cigarette paper, a spool of thread, all of which, by the way, are produced here in Vietnam, fish hooks, needles, a few buttons. All of these are rather simple things, but they're very useful. They're very well accepted. This is not the method, gentlemen. That's it. Come. All gone. And, hey, Tony, tell them bust it up or they get nothing.
Pacification, under the many fancy names it's been known here, has never worked. And it never will work as long as the inefficiency and corruption continues at the highest government levels. The problem of Vietnam is not poverty, it's social inequality. For instance, take the Mekong Delta, one of the richest areas in Southeast Asia. Yet this is where the war began. And personally, I think this is where it's going to end.
This is an opinion shared by another journalist, Dick West.
This is My Tho, a typical Delta city. There's always a pleasant breeze from the Mekong. There's always a very interesting view over the River Life, even from this gimcrack hotel, and even in this broken down, shoddy city. This is the real battlefield, the loyalty of 6 million people. The Americans and the North Vietnamese play little part here in the Delta. This is civil war between South Vietnamese. As the peace talks dawdle on in Paris, both sides are struggling for a bigger share of the Delta, meaning more power, more votes, more wealth, more rice, and more little flags to stick on the map. The battle in this colossally fertile rice country is fought with guns, but even more with propaganda, as both sides contest each province, each district within each province, each village within each district, and even each hamlet within each village. Delta people are very friendly, very courteous. They always offer you a cup of tea when you go and see them in their house. They're very dignified. And in a way, you'd think this is the most pleasant place, most agreeable place. But every now and then something picks you up. You suddenly realize there is a war going on. At first they told us this was a very secure village, and by Delta standards it is. But a great many people have been killed here, and they don't always sleep easily at night. And a great part of the village, as we later found out, is more or less controlled, if not terrorized, by the Viet Cong. The real strength of the VC comes from the tremendous hostility of the villagers towards the corruption of the central government in Saigon and of the provincial governments. The Viet Cong appreciate where their strength lies. And whenever they come into the village and hold a little meeting, a little propaganda meeting, always the beginning and the end of their address is a great tirade against the thieves of Saigon. One of the teachers in this village said that only the children who actually lived near the school actually went to the school, because the ones who lived a long way away might find when they went back after school that their parents had evacuated the village altogether, been bombed, there'd been a battle, and that they'd joined the enormous legion of lost children in the Delta. The result is that many parents who live a long way away from the school, they keep their children at home, make them do the traditional jobs like tending the fields or perhaps even looking after the younger children.
Giúp đỡ xã chúng tôi, trong đó là đồng bào 5.170 mấy người đó, để họ có ý kiến muốn như vậy đó.
If I might suggest this to him, please, Mr. Chi, that when he sends it into the province chief and the deputy for administration, if they would go ahead and form...
The lack of security, along with the corruption, explains the villagers' lack of confidence in the government. For John Dodson, a local government man from Texas, it's not always easy trying to persuade these villagers to put their faith in the government in Saigon.
The boar keeper who has the animal husbandry subcommittee appointed the boar keeper.
Thưa giờ tiểu ban và chăn nuôi giờ có cử một người để giữ heo nọc đó không?
Could I ask them what are their plans with the boar? I mean, what will their plans be? Have they formulated plans on how they're going to use the boar to upgrade the breed of hogs throughout the village?
John Dodson is a very kind man, a very capable man. I'm sure he was a very good town manager in Texas. But one begins to wonder, and I think he begins to wonder, what exactly is he doing here in Vietnam? The phrases of town management, of subcommittees, really don't mean very much to the villagers here.
Dick West is a freelance writer on an assignment for the Sunday Times. Unlike Arnett, he's not tied to a deadline. This allows him time to follow up what really interests him, the quieter background story.
I always feel when I look at the popular force that I can sympathize with that character in the Graham Greene novel, The Quiet American, who is stuck out in a fort And he talks about himself and about the Vietnamese troops. And he says, with a return ticket, courage becomes an intellectual exercise, like a monk's flagellation. How much can I stick? Those poor devils can't catch a plane home. These popular force here in this village, they're mostly from the village. They're here to protect their homes, their family graves, everything which is dear to them, and they probably will fight. Most villages are not so fortunate.
Mai vẫn liên lạc nhà được không? Được. Trước có tiếng động trước đó. Tăng gọi cho xe ta lại.
The popular force have a good time during the day. They can loaf around, they can go to a party, they can chat with their friends, they can stroll around with a sprig of bougainvillea stuck in the end of their carbine. But when night comes, it's a different matter, because in the night the Viet Cong come into their own.
Đổ ra dữ lắm hả? Tại ta gánh tên gì ta xài chứ đâu mình đâu có.
The villager in Vietnam is very much of the village. He doesn't like to leave the village. His ancestors have been buried there. His house, his patch of land, are something very important to him, and this is why so many Vietnamese are miserable when they're forcibly deported from one village and resettled in a new village which may have all the amenities and be even more fertile, but they don't like it. Some went away to fight. This Marine fought 20 days in the Battle of Hue last year. He was shot in the spine and invalided out. Now he's without a job. Several hundred men from this village have been killed in the war. The casualties are probably not as high as in most villages. They're still so enormous that the women outnumber the men by about 2 to 1. One doesn't hear much about the war in the Delta, although a great deal of the fighting is going on here. The main reason is that the Americans, and to a certain extent the European coverage of the war, is mostly interested in where Americans are fighting. Americans are white, we identify with them. Vietnamese getting killed is not so emotive. She was married to a popular force soldier in this village who was ambushed one day and killed by the Viet Cong. For about a year she lived on his salary, which amounted to about 3 or 4 pounds a month. Since then she's had to cope for herself like all the other 80 widows in this village. She has very little prospect of marrying again, because there are so many spare women in the village that only a very poor man indeed would marry a widow rather than a virgin, which is what most Vietnamese men want.
Tôi dẫn một trung đội nghĩa quân đi phục kích ở trong, thì đi về mỗi 10 giờ đêm đi về có 3 người, còn bao nhiêu ở lại đó. Đi về tới gần đất Thánh á, thì cậu phục kích chết 3 người chết hết.
Her great hope in life is to see her children get a very good education and go on to Mỹ Tho or Saigon, and she will follow them. But she said that really she'd prefer to stay in the village because this is where she was born and this is where she hopes to die. She's a school teacher. She earns about £5 a month, which is about 1/10 what she'd get in Saigon if she worked as a hostess in a bar. She doesn't have too bad a life, but it's had some unpleasant moments. About 2 years ago, in this very safe village. The Viet Cong surrounded this house from 3 sides and opened up with machine guns. Her father was shot to a bloody mess in the middle of the room. Both sides used terrorism. An American in this province, who certainly should know, said they had several agencies whose job was to go into VC hamlets and murder people. He called it eliminating the VC infrastructure. These revolutionary development cadres, as they're called, are an imitation of what the communists first did in the Delta. The communists sent trained agitators into the villages, trying to get the villagers to enroll behind them. And then about 5 years ago, the Saigon government decided it was time that they got in on this. So they trained their own cadres. They decked them out in black pajamas, just as the communists had done. And they even used the word revolutionary, because the Americans kept telling them that revolution was a very necessary thing, although they made it clear it mustn't be a communist revolution. Well, this has been going on some years now, and every time you come back to the Delta, there's the same old program that always has a different name. First it was the Revolutionary Development Program, then the Pacification and Development Program, then just the Pacification Program, and now this year it's the Accelerated Pacification Program. The acceleration is more wish than hope, because 2 years ago the government claimed 72% of this province as government-controlled, and this year only 52%. So it's a kind of acceleration, but nobody quite knows in which direction.
Đêm nhớ anh buồn nghe mưa khóc bên mành.
The great phrase you hear everywhere from the Americans, and indeed from the Vietnamese who've learnt it from the Americans, is motivation. They want the villagers to be motivated. Now, translated into normal English, this means faithful to the government, eager, brave, confident, and in general on the right side. But unfortunately, for the sake of the Saigon government, the Viet Cong too want the villagers to be motivated, though they probably don't use the same word. And with the result that the villagers themselves refuse to stand up and be counted for either side. They keep their political views, and when either side comes in with its team of RD cadres, or from the other side its team of communist cadres, they smile at them, maybe listen to their songs and watch their dances, and they go off and think their own thoughts. This woman's husband left home in 1954 and is thought to have gone to the north of Vietnam. She may herself be a VC, but it's not the sort of question you ask in a village, because you never know who's going to be listening. Possibly she doesn't want to commit herself. If she said she was a VC, she'd risk going to prison, or maybe worse. If she said she wasn't a VC, she might get in trouble with the VC. In a village like this, you never know whose side people are on. There are VC agents in the popular force, and similarly, there are people in the VC districts who report back to the various agencies. This is mostly a Catholic village, and therefore anti-communist. But this woman, who is a Buddhist, has 3 children who have gone to join the Viet Cong. Only one daughter has stayed with her. As one of the village chiefs told us in a Vietnamese proverb, In any big granary, a few grains of rice will slip through the cracks in the floor and feed the rats. But in the Delta as a whole, it's more than a few grains of rice who've gone to join the VC. The Viet Cong morale is excellent, I was told by an American advisor in this province. It's difficult to explain this because the Viet Cong in this Delta area are constantly pounded by B-52 bombs, by artillery, sometimes by napalm. How do they keep their strength? Well, maybe it's just because of this, that it's a reaction against bombing, against continual artillery strikes which often hit innocent homes. The Delta is such a highly populated area that any bomb or any shell is just as likely to hit an innocent civilian as it is to hit a Viet Cong.
Cái xương này nó còn miếng miếng, luôn luôn phải nằm trong bà phán sạch sẽ vệ sinh rồi lát chích thuốc.
This woman has a shrapnel wound from a stray shell. Nobody knows, or indeed even cares, from which side it came.
Thương là bà giữ cẩn thận giùm bà ba.
There are no doctors outside the big towns, and this village is very lucky to have a trained male nurse.
Không sao, thích người thương là mình cứu được. Trong mình bà có mệt cái gì không? Mà sẽ có cái thuốc khỏe cho bà. Là
nó cũng giảm rồi, cũng bớt đau rồi.
The Americans do their best to avoid unnecessary casualties. They have a genuine concern not to hurt the slope heads, or slopes as they call the Vietnamese. But accidents will happen.
Sao? Mà trái cho bông đồ này khao mà.
The war's going on all the time, all around, but the villagers scarcely seem to notice it. Very often when I've been walking through a Delta village and a very loud explosion or small arms fire has sounded nearby, I've jumped about a foot into the air. I dislike this kind of noise very much. And I've turned and said to some Vietnamese, "What was that?" And they just look up and say, "What was what?" I mean, they simply hadn't even heard anything. This is a safe village by Delta standards, meaning that only about a third of it is controlled by the Viet Cong at night. For instance, this old lady lives in one of the districts of the village that is not so safe. She pays taxes to both sides, to the government in the day and to the Viet Cong when they come in, as they do every month, to collect money or rice. She gets used to it. When the Viet Cong knock on the door, she has to open it very quickly. They come in, have a look around just to see there are no men left in the house. Then they say, "Good evening, madam," and leave. But for her son-in-law, it's not so easy.
Má ở nhà, con đi tản cư, mai con về sớm. Con về sớm không? Dạ.
He also lives in this house, but only in the day. He's a fairly rich man, but he's always refused to pay taxes to the Viet Cong. So at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, every day, he and the other men in the village have to leave this part of the village, this secure village, and go to a more secure part of this secure village. There's a Chinese saying, "What do we care who rules the land, as long as we can plough our fields in peace?" It's tempting to apply this saying to the Mekong Delta as well. But in fact, the peasants of this delta are very political creatures. They began the war against the French in 1946. They began the war against the Saigon government in the end of the 1950s. They fought very hard and on both sides. There are hundreds of thousands of Catholics, smaller religious sects who are bitterly anti-communist. There are hundreds of thousands of communists who are bent on gaining power, absolute power. There are revolutionaries and there are conservatives. They all want peace. Everybody tells you they want peace. But the point is, do they want peace at any price? The price of any kind of government in Saigon.
Mark Frankland used to be the Observer's foreign correspondent in Moscow. Now, for the last 2 years, he's lived in Saigon.
Wherever a Vietnamese lives, whether it's in the towns or in the countryside, there's very little chance that he will see anything like real peace in the next few years. You see, this is a war about how Vietnam should change, whether it should move towards communism or, I suppose we could call it capitalism. And whichever way the country goes, in the next few years there's bound to be just simply more confusion and more violence. Hundreds and thousands of peasants have come to Saigon over the past few years simply to escape from the war. Either they've wanted to get away from the increased American use of firepower in the countryside or from heavier Viet Cong pressure on them, and they now live in the worst slum areas of the town. The irony is that last year the city didn't even provide them security from the war. Some hundreds of Viet Cong managed to get into this part of the town in May and June, and the only way the Americans then thought they could get rid of them was by bombing most of the houses and destroying a good deal of the area. These refugees here are some of the victims of that fighting. In fact, they're really not too badly off by refugee standards in Vietnam. They've got electricity and not bad houses and running water. But the most important thing about them is that, like all the other peasants who've had to come to Saigon, is that they're losing their identity. They've lost contact with everything that made life meaningful to them. Since the young men are fighting in the army on one side or another, it's the women, the old men, and sometimes even the young children who are being turned into a new sort of proletariat for what is Saigon's main industry, servicing the war. But it certainly brought tremendous activity to the city. The people who grow these vegetables to feed the workers in Saigon are certainly making big profits, and so are other people as ingenious and skillful as they are. Yet it's still a quite artificial economy, and when peace comes it could easily collapse. unless the Americans choose to bolster it up, which they probably will do. And the best Vietnamese economists are certainly very worried by a situation where a country that once exported rice to the rest of the world is now having to import it from America just to feed Saigon. Naturally, it's the children who are most affected by the disruption that the wars caused to Vietnamese society.
Chẳng nào đây mà không có lúc người trên đường đời hợp tan như thế thôi.
The children in this hostel somehow got separated from their parents when the fighting came to their villages. They drifted to Saigon, got caught up by the police, and luckily a Catholic priest then selected them to live in his hostel. And they go out from here every day to work as garage mechanics or newspaper sellers or as shoeshine boys. But of course they'll get no education. If the war goes on, they'll become soldiers, and even if peace does come, they'll lead a pretty rootless sort of existence. The old ways of life gone, and the new ways uncertain. The rich, at least, can buy their children a good education. They can send their children to university abroad, away from the war and the army, and one day the children will come home, if they do come home, with degrees and diplomas, and walk into the best jobs that Saigon has to offer. But then they've got their special problems. A father I know who, 20 years ago, thought nothing of sacrificing his youth to fighting with the Viet Minh against the French, feels ashamed about giving into this temptation. But then what can he do? He has no idea what's going to happen to Vietnam next year, and his family is the one certain thing that he's got to live for. The contrast between rich and poor is an obvious enough one anywhere in Asia. What disturbs Vietnamese much more, I think, is the contrast between Vietnamese and Americans.
Serving the capital, this is AFVN Saigon.
No one can spend 24 hours in Saigon without seeing something like this.
Hand signals to call a Vietnamese to you. Don't hook and waggle your finger palm up. Turn your hand over, palm down, and open and cup all your fingers together. They'll come quicker and happier. Palm or fingers up is an insult. Be nice.
And it's very hard always to blame the Americans. When the GI goes shopping in the PX, it's a terribly natural thing for him to do. It's as natural as for his wife to go shopping in the neighborhood supermarket. But for many Vietnamese, this is a display of wealth and privilege that arouses very mixed feelings. Feelings of hatred, envy, and sometimes, of course, downright admiration. This admiration is sometimes expressed in the most obvious way, imitation. And it's really rather sad to see Vietnamese girls, who are extraordinarily beautiful, paying a lot of money to have their eyes rounded and their noses straightened so that they can look more like Westerners.
Mẹ trông con mau bước về nhà, mẹ mong con lũ con đường xa, ôi lũ con cùng cha quên hận thù.
Kêu ngoài trên đi.
Of course, the more obvious the American influence becomes, the greater the tendency to shout about Vietnamese nationalism. You do come across in the most unlikely places a real feeling of Vietnam and what it means. For example, in this television studio where children are putting on a little, not very grand drama.
Ông ơi, gì vậy bà? Cả tôi bể luôn. Sao? Tôi mới vừa thấy ông Táo xuất hiện. Dở hoài. Thiệt mà. Lương thực để ăn dọc đường chứ.
Chưa chắc à.
Nữa. Hay lắm, hay lắm. Trời ơi, ông Tám xuất hiện. Trời ơi.
But Vietnamese traditions, after so many years of colonial rule and civil war and fighting, has been so battered and corrupted that really a lot of Vietnamese find it very hard to admire them anymore. And in these circumstances, Vietnamese nationalism will often be rather more theatrical than real.
One thing I should say is they have Americans, they have many good things that we have to learn about, and they also have many bad things. For example, I have been in Japan, and I have a lot of Japanese friends there. I learned that after the war, now Japan are very model, very, how do you call?
Very modernized.
Modernized, that's the word. But they still keep their own custom, culture, very old, traditional as Japanese.
As an actress who works abroad as well as in Vietnam, you must have special problems in planning your career. Can you look ahead? Do you make plans for next year and the year after?
Well, in Vietnam, nothing can be planned because we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We just live for this moment, and you dream for years in the future for what to do in 10 years from now or tomorrow. If peace coming to our country, I will do this, do that. But this is just like a dream.
So it's not surprising that the most popular songwriter in Saigon today, who feels passionately about the state of his country, can really only write sad songs.
Tình ngỡ đã quên đi như lòng cô lạnh lùng, người ngỡ đã xa xăm bỗng về quá thanh thang. Ôi áo xưa lồng lộng đã xô dạt trời chiều, như từng cơn nước rộng xóa một ngày điêu hiu. Tình ngỡ đã phôi pha nhưng tình vẫn còn đầy, người ngỡ đã đi xa nhưng người vẫn quanh đây. Những bước chân mềm mại đã đi vào đời người, như từng viên đá cuội rớt vào lòng biển khơi. Khi cơn đau chưa dài thì tình như chút nắng, khi cơn đau lên đầy thì tình đã mênh mang. Một người về đỉnh cao, một người về vực sâu, để cuộc tình chìm mau như bóng chim cuối đèo. Người ngỡ đã xa xưa nhưng người bỗng lại về, tình ngỡ sống xa đưa nhưng còn quá bao la. Ôi trái tim phiền muộn đã vui lại một giờ, như bờ xa nước cạn đã chìm vào cơn mưa.
like the Vietnamese themselves, Saigon can be deceptively quiet. Days go by when you'd hardly know that there was a war going on in the country. And in the early morning, when you hear the bombardments around the city, you could easily take them for the sound of thunder. "15 years ago, Graham Greene was working in Saigon on the Quiet American. Like everyone else, he used to take his aperitif in the cafe of the Continental Hotel. No one knew much about Vietnam then, but the sadness and the hopelessness were already there. But now all that has changed. At any one time, there are over 500 journalists in Vietnam, and practically everybody in the world's got their own ideas of what the country is like. Yet no one's ever quite caught its ambiguous attraction as well as Graham Greene. For you probably can't understand Vietnam unless you, at one time, feel its pull. The French were seduced by Vietnam for all the blood it cost them, and men like Monsieur Atavi, the patron of the Hotel Royal in Saigon, will probably never leave it.
Très bien, et vous? Vous avez l'air très... Oui, ça va à peu près. Assez vous répondre... Je suis ravi de vous voir quelquefois.
To look at him now, courteous and quietly fatalistic, you'd never guess at the terrible things that the French and the Vietnamese once did to each other.
Dieu seul le sait, Monsieur Frankland. Je n'ai jamais voulu, en somme, déterminer ma vie moi-même. Que je sois ici ou ailleurs, pour moi c'est à peu près la même chose. Vous savez, à mon âge, on n'espère plus grand-chose. Mais jeune, oui, je suis jeune.
You don't parade old scars in Vietnam. Life would be unbearable if you did. It was here at the racetrack a year ago that the Viet Cong set up one of their headquarters for the Tet attack. But today the horses are running and the betting's quite as energetic as it ever was. But in spite of this resilience, the scars are there all right. The young people walking in the zoo on Sunday look composed and elegant enough, but I don't suppose that if you asked any one of them, they'd be able to tell you with any certainty what the future was going to bring them. And this sense of confusion is probably greater still today, because everybody's talking about peace, but no one really has a very clear idea of what that peace is going to mean. Life goes on in Saigon because ordinary people just feel that they no longer can control the big events. Celebrate Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, by buying as many flowers and as many new things as you can afford. But in a way, the saddest thing about Vietnam is this feeling of helplessness. I remember one of the wisest Vietnamese I've ever met saying that he thought North and South Vietnam were like two fighting cocks, goaded into combat by the communist and capitalist worlds. Certainly there's never been any shortage of people shouting advice at the Vietnamese. And I sometimes wonder whether one of the two sides really must be beaten before the fighting can come to an end.
Ngàn 300 đi.